Hello and welcome. A terror attack would easily overwhelm America's hospitals, according to a new US government report. That warning comes just days after Al-Qaeda was declared the greatest threat to the US and its allies. The US State Department's annual report on terrorism emphasized that the risk of Al-Qaeda acquiring and using weapons of mass destruction is a top security concern. The State Department also said that while significant progress was made in the fight against Al-Qaeda last year, the group has been able to rebuild some of its operations capabilities and replace senior fighters who've been captured or killed. For our discussion today, we're asking, can the so-called war on terror ever be won, and what would constitute a victory? We'd like to include your views on this topic, and you can contact us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Well, joining me to discuss this issue here in Washington, D.C. is Michael Scheuer, who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency for 22 years. He's heading the CIA's unit, he headed the CIA's unit tracking Osama bin Laden for 3 years and became a special advisor to that unit after the 9/11 attacks. Also with me is Farhana Ali from the RAND Corporation. Her analysis of radical groups has been widely published, and she is focused on the role of women within extremist groups. So I want to welcome you both to the program. And
thank you.
Michael Scheuer, first, I want to ask you if the war on terror really is, if there really is such a thing as a war on terror, or is it really a mechanism that allows, a rallying cry in America that allows politicians and those with vested interest to keep the people on edge?
I think there's a genuine conflict between the United States and the forces that are represented by Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. I think that it's probably a more dangerous threat than even our leaders have talked about, because we're still stuck in America with candidates for president and a president who tells us that Muslims hate freedom and hate liberty and hate all these things that we stand for, and of course that's not true. We've not taken the measure of this enemy. And I think there is, on your point exactly, there is a tendency within this administration to try to frighten people rather than to have them understand.
Now, in your opinion and your experience, how much is the US exacerbating the situation, making it worse and creating enemies? Actually, isolating and ostracizing groups outside who just can then rally under this cry of being anti-American?
Well, I think that's exactly right. There is an element of self-deception in Washington under both parties. We're being attacked not because of who we are, but because of what we do. Right. And no American presidential candidate or politician is going to say that to the American people. And until we get that straight, we're going to keep increasing the number of enemies we face and keep mobilizing that enemy force.
Okay, well, Farhana Ali, how do you regard this concept of war on terror?
I think the war on terrorism has become a misnomer. In fact, so what's happened and what's been quite dangerous is that we've lumped every terrorist organization and every extremist group under this concept of war on terrorism. And so it's actually justified actions that have been taken by certain states under this war on terror rubric. Instead, what should be done is actually to disaggregate the threat. And this is actually a comment that's not come from me, but other senior policymakers. David Kilcullen, who's within the Defense Department, makes this point very clear, that by disaggregating the threat and looking at various extremist groups within their local context, taking into account social, political, economic factors, we'll have a better understanding of this concept of what we call knowing thy enemy. And I think then we can revise our counterterrorism policies and strategies to fight those groups that are of our threat to us.
Do you think this aggregation of the threat actually in reality makes the threat aggregate? That is, people then link up. People have then, in certain parts of the world, started associating themselves with Al-Qaeda, even if they had no real affiliation or no interest, perhaps, in that brand before.
Absolutely, and that's why Osama bin Laden has often been called the vanguard of the Muslim people, and he's seen as a champion of standing for just or perceived injustices against the Muslim world by the West, and that has actually become another deadly perception that's fed through by disaggregating this.
Michael Scheuer, I know you do believe that Al-Qaeda is a serious threat, as you mentioned. In what way? What do you think is the real threat to the USA and its allies?
Well, the allies, I think, are a separate issue. The threat to the United States is an attack within the United States worse than 9/11. And clearly, we've done everything we can as a government to help Al-Qaeda do that. We have not secured the Soviet nuclear arsenal. We have not secured our borders. We have maintained policies that are making Al-Qaeda grow. And we continue to identify Al-Qaeda as a terrorist group, which is a misnomer. If anything, it's an insurgent organization which very easily replaces its losses. So we have overestimated in our own minds the degree of damage we've done to it. So I think the main threat to the United States remains Al-Qaeda, and it remains in this country.
You were head of the bin Laden tracking issue, or the issue station,
Yes.
I should say, that tracked Osama bin Laden. Do you know where he is? Do you have a reasonable idea? And do you think he'll ever be caught?
I think he's right now more likely to die of old age than to be killed or caught. Mr. Clinton had the chance, surely, to kill him multiple times. But the problem for America right now is we've tried to do Afghanistan on the cheap. We have less than 30,000 troops in a country bigger than Texas, and they have a dozen jobs to do. I think it's very unlikely we'll ever find him.
Farhan Ali, how strong do you think Al-Qaeda is today? I mean, is the perception of how strong it is and the things that Michael Scheuer has described, do you believe that it is stronger post 9/11 or weaker?
Well, that's actually an excellent question, and I think you can measure the strength by where Al-Qaeda is today. And in fact, Al-Qaeda's strength is its ability to adapt. It is a diffuse organization, and so even though it's not the hierarchical, pyramidal structure that it was during the time of the Afghan Jihad and decades ago, its strength is its ability to actually multiply itself in these various networks. And one of its core strengths has always been its propaganda machine. And that's one of the things that actually has concern for even counterterrorism analysts in this country, is how do we then devise an effective mechanism to counter the propaganda that Al-Qaeda maintains great strength with.
I want to get an email question that came in from Eritrea, from Samir Abdu. And Michael, if I could put this to you, it says, a fresh attempt at definition is desperately needed. What does it really mean to wage war against non-state actors residing in countries like Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan and Iraq, which are all allies of the US? And what does fighting terrorism really mean? Terrorism is a concept or an activity at best, not an enemy.
I think that's exactly right, and I think terrorism is a very unhelpful concept. Certainly Al-Qaeda and its allies are bigger, stronger, better organized than any terrorist group we've ever run into. I think the correct model maybe is Lebanese Hezbollah when they defeated the Israelis in southern Lebanon. The concept, I'm afraid, is that for the United States is at some point we're going to have to destroy Al-Qaeda to the greatest extent possible. Part of that is making sure that its message is unable to unite Muslims, and that's going to take a change in U.S. foreign policy.
I'll get on to some of the issues you raised there in a moment, but Mohammed is on the line from Malawi. Mohammed, what would you like to ask? Go ahead, Mohammed. Have we lost you?
Well, talking about war on terror, what I would like to know is this actually a war on terror or is it war on Islam? Because the way we look at the thing that is going on right now is there is war in Afghanistan, there is war in Somalia, there is war in Iraq, and there is only problems in the Muslim world.
Mohammed, let me put this to Farhan Ali, because I know this is an area on which you've focused, that the fact that it's perceived by a lot of people as a war on Islam.
Yeah, that's actually something that I run into very frequently as well when I give talks, and I being, once considered a moderate mainstream Muslim in this country. There's also the perception that this is a war within Islam. So there's one argument that this is a war against Islam, and there is that perception. And I think that things like Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and images like that and events like that actually feed into that stereotype and that perception. But there's also another war that's been raised very frequently, in the war within Islam, the war between the moderates and the extremists, that also needs to be recognized and is another issue that's separate but actually related to this.
Michael Scheuer, I'd like to quote from your book, Marching Towards Hell. There's a bit where you talk about the US-Israeli relationship. And in this, you say, the inauguration and domestication of the US-Israel relationship surely ranks as one of the least debated and most undemocratic watershed events in American history, one that is now costing us blood and treasure and will cost us much more of each in the future. Obviously, that's an issue that is central to the debate and used as an excuse by a lot of groups who are insurgents, saying that they are supporting this, this inequity. I wonder, A, to what extent, if that issue is resolved, that it would actually take the wind out of the sails of groups?
Well, that's certainly one of the issues that needs to be addressed, the Arab-Israeli issue. The other issues, we have to do something about oil. As long as we're dependent on oil from the Middle East, we're going to support governments that are oppressive and tyrannical. I think the key on the Israeli question is what's in America's interest to do. There's no strategic interest involved with our relationship with the Israelis. And we've put ourselves in the absurd position, really, of being involved in someone else's religious war, the Arabs versus the Israelis, and now we're backing both sides. We're the main protector and funder of the Israelis, and we're the main protector of the Saudis. It's an extraordinarily ludicrous position.
Now, you say a religious war because, I mean, a lot of people fail to realize many Palestinians are Christian, that it's a territorial thing.
Well, it's territorial, but it's increasingly, I think, on the Palestinian side, you can see this, the Islamist movement slowly taking over what was a Christian, secular, you know, almost a socialist movement in the 70s and 60s. But it's changing.
Let's get in a quick call from Mohammed in Bangladesh before we take a break. So, Mohammed, what would you like to ask? Mohammed?
I would like to ask that how the mightiest country in the world assesses that Al-Qaeda is a threat to America.
Okay, I'll leave that to you, Mike.
Well, because our leaders in both parties realize that America is defenseless. They've not closed their borders. They've not controlled our borders, rather. They are continuing to push policies that aggravate and anger more and more Muslims around the world. And our military force is stretched to the point where we can no longer respond adequately to other threats. I think that's all three of those reasons are a very good reason to worry about Al-Qaeda.
And just a quick thought, Farhan Ali, Muslims have been roped into that too, and it's not just Al-Qaeda is the threat now, but to Americans, Muslims are a threat.
Well, actually, that's an interesting issue because many American Muslims, as much as they feel that they've been part of the American system, they're professionals in this country, I mean, they feel it's just as American as anyone else. And yet profiling continues to exist, particularly for Muslim men who cross the border and come back, go to their host countries and come back to this country. That's another issue. You have Muslim, not diaspora, but diasporas communities. And I think that, you know, on one level, you've got a professional class. You also have a struggling class of Muslims at various levels. And so it's going to take time before Muslims are fully integrated into this country.
All right, we've got more questions for you, including David is holding on the phone in London. David, we'll get you in a second. We're going to take a very short break. We're back with more analysis on the so-called war on terror in just a moment.